Imagine this. You land at the airport after a long international flight. You're exhausted, jet-lagged, just wanting to get through customs and go home. As you walk through the terminal, you pass a man sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. You don't think twice about it. The next week, you're back at the same airport for another trip. And there he is again. Same bench, same newspaper, same clothes. A month later, you see him again, still there. You start to wonder, does this man ever leave? The answer is no. He doesn't leave. He can't leave. Because this airport isn't just where he waits for flights. This airport is his home, and it has been for nearly 2 decades. This is the absolutely insane true story of Mehran Karimi Nasseri, the man who got trapped living inside Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport for 18 years. And trust me, the reason why he stayed is even more unbelievable than the fact that he did. In 1988, a well-dressed Iranian man in his early 40s walked into Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport. His name was Mehran Karimi Nasseri, though he preferred to go by Sir Alfred. He carried a small briefcase, wore a neat suit, and looked like any other international traveler passing through one of the world's busiest airports. Mehran was on his way to London. He had his ticket, he had his luggage, he had his documentation. Everything seemed perfectly normal. He checked in for his flight, went through the initial security checks, and settled into the departure lounge to wait for his boarding call. But Mehran Karimi Nasseri would never board that flight to London. In fact, he wouldn't leave this airport for the next 18 years. Let me explain how a simple trip to London turned into nearly 2 decades of living in an airport terminal. Mehran was born in 1945 in Masjid Suleiman, Iran, to an Iranian father and a British mother. This detail, his British mother, would become crucial to his story. Growing up in Iran during a time of political instability, Mehran always felt caught between 2 worlds. He wasn't fully accepted as Iranian because of his British heritage, and he wasn't considered fully British because he was born in Iran. In 1977, when Mehran was in his early 30s, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He became involved in protests against the Shah of Iran, the ruling monarch whose regime was known for suppressing political dissent. Mehran wasn't a violent revolutionary or a radical extremist. He was simply a man who believed in freedom and spoke out against injustice. The Shah's government didn't take kindly to protesters. Mehran was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually expelled from Iran. They stripped him of his Iranian citizenship and threw him out of the country. At 32 years old, Mehran Karimi Nasseri became a man without a country. But Mehran had a backup plan. His mother was British, which meant he could claim British citizenship through her. He applied for refugee status and began the long, bureaucratic process of getting proper documentation. After years of jumping through legal hoops, living in refugee camps, and navigating the nightmare of international bureaucracy, Mehran finally received his refugee documents from the United Nations in 1988. Freedom, at last. Or so he thought. With his new UN refugee documentation, Mehran could finally travel to the United Kingdom, where he hoped to settle permanently and start a new life. He booked a flight with a layover in Paris. The plan was simple: fly from Brussels to Paris, then from Paris to London. Easy. Mehran boarded his flight from Brussels to Paris without incident. He landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, collected his belongings, and prepared to check in for his connecting flight to London. And that's when everything fell apart. As Mehran approached the check-in counter for his London flight, the airline staff asked to see his documentation. He reached into his briefcase and his refugee papers were gone. Gone. Vanished. Not there. Mehran's heart must have dropped into his stomach. He frantically searched through his briefcase, his pockets, his luggage. Nothing. His precious UN refugee documents, the papers he'd spent years obtaining, the only proof of his legal status, his ticket to a new life, had disappeared. To this day, what happened to those documents remains a mystery. Mehran claimed they were stolen while he was on the flight, or in the Brussels airport. Others suggested he might have accidentally lost them. Some conspiracy theories even proposed that someone deliberately took them to trap him. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Mehran Karimi Nasseri was now standing in a French airport with no valid documentation. The French authorities were called. They looked at his situation and delivered devastating news. Without proper documentation, Mehran could not enter France. But here's where it gets truly Kafkaesque. He also couldn't leave France because no other country would accept him without papers. He couldn't go forward to London. He couldn't go backward to Belgium. He couldn't even officially enter France to try to sort out the paperwork. Mehran was stuck, legally trapped in the international transit zone of Charles de Gaulle's airport. The transit zone is a strange legal limbo. It's technically not France, it's international territory. People pass through it between flights, but they're not considered to have entered the country. And for Mehran, this legal gray area became his prison. The French authorities told him he had two options. He could voluntarily return to Iran, which had expelled him, and would likely imprison or execute him for his political activities. Or he could stay in the airport until his legal situation was resolved. Mehran chose the airport. He thought it would be temporary, maybe a few days, maybe a week or two while he sorted out replacement documents. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Mehran Karimi Nasseri became a permanent resident of Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle Airport. So how do you live in an airport for 18 years? At first, Mehran tried to maintain some dignity. He would sleep on the red plastic benches in the terminal, using his briefcase as a pillow. He stored his few belongings in airport lockers. He washed up in the public bathrooms, trying to keep himself clean and presentable. He ate whatever cheap food he could afford from airport vendors. The airport staff started to notice him. At first, they thought he was just a passenger who'd missed his flight. Then they realized he was always there, day after day, week after week. This well-dressed Iranian man was actually living in their airport. Initially, security would try to move him along, asking him to leave. But where could he go? He had nowhere else to be. He legally couldn't leave the transit zone. Eventually, the staff just accepted him. Mehran became part of the airport's furniture, as much a fixture of Terminal 1 as the departure boards and baggage carousels. Mehran established a routine. He would wake up on his bench around 5:30 a.m. He'd go to the bathroom to wash his face and brush his teeth. He'd spend his days reading newspapers and magazines that travelers left behind. He'd write in his diary, documenting his bizarre existence. He'd watch the endless parade of travelers coming and going, people starting journeys, returning home, reuniting with loved ones, while he remained frozen in place. Airport employees started to feel sympathy for him. Some would bring him food. Others would give him money. A few would sit and talk with him during their breaks, and Mehran proved to be educated, articulate, and surprisingly cheerful despite his circumstances. He spoke several languages and had intelligent conversations about politics, philosophy, and world events. A journalist eventually discovered Mehran's story and wrote an article about him. Suddenly, this man living in the airport became famous. More journalists came, then documentary filmmakers. Mehran's story spread around the world. People were fascinated by this real-life castaway trapped in an airport. How was this possible in the modern world? How could someone fall through the cracks of bureaucracy so completely? Mehran became a minor celebrity. Travelers would come to Terminal 1 specifically to meet him, take photos with him, and hear his story firsthand. The publicity helped in some ways. People would donate money to Mehran, which allowed him to buy better food and basic necessities. The airport authorities, embarrassed by the international attention, upgraded their tolerance of him. They gave him more privacy and stopped trying to forcibly remove him. But the publicity didn't solve his fundamental problem. He still had no documentation. He still couldn't legally leave. Here's where the story takes its first major twist. After several years of living in the airport, With lawyers and human rights organizations trying to help him, Mehran was finally offered a solution in 1999, 11 years after he first got stuck. The Belgian government, the French government, and various refugee organizations came together and offered Mehran legal papers. They would give him official refugee status. He could leave the airport. He could start a real life. After more than a decade of living on a bench in an airport terminal, Mehran Karimi Nasseri was being handed his freedom on a silver platter. And he refused it. Yes, you heard that right. After 11 years of being trapped in the airport, when finally given the chance to leave, Mehran said no. Why? This is where the story gets truly fascinating and heartbreaking. The documents they offered him didn't list him as Sir Alfred Mehran, which is what he believed his name should be, claiming his mother's British heritage. The papers listed him under a different version of his name. To most people, this would seem like a minor administrative detail. Just accept the papers and leave. But to Mehran, it was about identity. After losing everything, his country, his citizenship, his freedom, his name was all he had left. He refused to accept documents that didn't reflect who he believed himself to be. Lawyers and officials tried to reason with him. They explained that he could accept these papers and sort out the name issue later. They pointed out that he was free to leave, to have a real life again. But Mehran was stubborn. Or perhaps he had been institutionalized by his years in the airport. Or maybe, after 11 years, he simply didn't know how to be anything other than the man who lives in the airport. Whatever his reasoning, Mehran turned down the documents and stayed put. The years continued to pass. 1999 became 2000. The new millennium arrived, and Mehran was still there, sleeping on his bench in Terminal 1. But here's the second massive twist to this story, and it's the one that makes this tale even stranger. In the early 2000s, after Mehran's story had become internationally famous, Hollywood came calling. Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks studio bought the rights to Mehran's life story. They created a fictionalized version and made it into a major motion picture called The Terminal, starring Tom Hanks and directed by Spielberg himself. The movie, released in 2004, told the story of Viktor Navorsky, a traveler who gets trapped in JFK Airport when his country undergoes a coup while he's in the air, rendering his passport invalid. Just like Mehran, Viktor can't enter the United States, can't return home, and ends up living in the airport terminal. The film was a hit, making over $219 million at the box office worldwide. Tom Hanks received critical acclaim for his performance. Audiences were charmed by this heartwarming story of a man making the best of an impossible situation. And the real Mehran? He received a payment from DreamWorks for the rights to his story. Reports vary, but sources suggest he received somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. Finally, after 16 years of living on donated food and spare change, Mehran had money. Real money. Enough money to live comfortably for years. He could rent an apartment. He could start over. He could leave. And yet, he stayed. Even with a Hollywood fortune in his bank account, Mehran Karimi Nasseri continued to live on his bench in Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle Airport. He had the money to leave. He had the legal right to leave. He'd eventually accepted documentation in 1999, but never acted on it. He had literally every reason to leave. But by this point, the airport had become his identity. He was the man who lives in the airport. It's who he was known as. It's what made him special. Outside the airport, he'd just be another aging refugee with a strange story. Inside the airport, he was a living legend. Psychologists who studied his case suggested that Mehran had developed a form of institutionalization, similar to prisoners who spend so long in jail that they can't function in the outside world. The airport, as strange as it sounds, had become his home. He knew every corner of Terminal 1. He knew the staff. He knew the routines. The chaos and uncertainty of the outside world frightened him more than the monotony of airport life. The years continued to pass. 2004 became 2005, then 2006. Mehran's health began to decline. Living on benches and eating airport food for nearly 2 decades had taken its toll. He developed medical issues. Airport staff, who had known him for years and had grown fond of this strange, gentle man, convinced him to finally leave the airport in 2006 to receive medical treatment. After 18 years, 6,570 days, Mehran Karimi Nasseri finally left Charles de Gaulle Airport. He was taken to a hospital in Paris. For the first time since 1988, he slept in a real bed, in a real room, outside the airport. He received medical care and was eventually moved to a social services facility where he could receive ongoing support. And that should be the end of the story. The man who lived in the airport for 18 years finally gets to experience real life again. Happy ending, right? Not quite. Here's the final twist, and it's perhaps the saddest part of this entire saga. In September 2022, 16 years after leaving the airport, at the age of 76, Mehran Karimi Nasseri returned to Charles de Gaulle Airport. He came back to Terminal 1, his old home. He sat on a bench, the same kind of bench he'd slept on for 18 years. And there, on November 12, 2022, Mehran Karimi Nasseri suffered a heart attack and died in the airport that had been his home for nearly 2 decades. He had come full circle. The airport staff who found him said he seemed peaceful, almost like he'd come home. Perhaps, in his final days, Mehran realized that the airport wasn't his prison. It was the only place where he'd ever truly belonged. Mehran Karimi Nasseri's story raises profound questions about identity, bureaucracy, freedom, and what home really means. Was he a victim of an absurd system that failed him? Or did he choose his fate by refusing solutions that would have freed him? The truth is probably both. Mehran was initially trapped by circumstances beyond his control, stolen documents and bureaucratic red tape. But as the years passed, he became trapped by something more complex: his own need for identity, his institutionalization, and perhaps a fear of returning to a world that had rejected him so many times before. In a bizarre way, the airport gave Mehran what Iran, Britain, Belgium, and France never could: a place where he existed. Not as a refugee, not as a stateless person, not as someone without citizenship, but simply as Mehran, the man in Terminal 1. Hollywood made millions telling a romanticized version of his story, but the real story is far stranger, sadder, and more complex than any movie could capture. Mehran spent 18 years of his life in legal limbo, living in a space that was nowhere and everywhere at once, belonging to no country and somehow belonging to all of them. He had the money to leave. He had the papers to leave. But he stayed. And when he finally did leave, he came back to die in the only place that had ever felt like home. This is the true story of Mehran Karimi Nasseri, the man who lived in the airport for 18 years, the man who inspired the terminal, the man who had freedom offered to him and chose to stay trapped anyway. Sometimes the strangest prisons aren't made of bars. They're made of bureaucracy, identity, and the human need to belong somewhere, anywhere, even if that somewhere is just a bench in an airport terminal.